Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com. This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Welcome to another edition of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Adrian Garcia, Director of Fair Housing in the Commercial Property Division for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. On today's show, we will talk about the affordable housing crisis. Some believe that this crisis started in 2008. Others believe it started during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. But this housing crisis, though new for some, has been in effect for much longer than that in communities of color. However, because of the mass effect that this crisis is having on people of all abilities, ethnicities, races, colors, and genders, it has become so large it can no longer be ignored. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, between December 2017 and September 2022, the median rent for newly leased units rose nearly 32%. They go on to say that in 2019, about 9.4 million households without rental assistance paid more than 50% of their income on rent or lived in severely inadequate housing. Of these, 7.8 million were very low income, defined by HUD as at or below the federal poverty line. Our guest today has spent much of his life studying the inequalities and the gaps it produces in wealth, health, education, and overall quality of life. Charles Gallagher is professor of sociology at Salle University. He is an expert in matters of social inequity and inequality and has edited 12 books, published 16 academic book chapters, and authored 7 peer-reviewed journal articles on issues related to race relations, discrimination, and immigration. He was a Fulbright scholar to the UK and has presented over 50 professional talks in the United States and been interviewed about matters of racial inequality over 100 times here and around the world. Professor Gallagher routinely serves as an expert race relations witness on federal cases regarding civil rights and violations. Welcome, Professor Gallagher, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Richard, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the question that I'm curious about is why this work? Why these topics of inequality, and what led you to it?
So thank you for that question. I kind of think that I came to want to study inequality in a general sense, really from a high school project. In 9th grade, I did a book report, and my father kind of pushed me to the topic of the day in Philadelphia. This would be in the mid-'70s, that the Philadelphia Police Commission was under consent decree because the federal government found that it had violated the civil rights of Philadelphia citizens, particularly black and brown citizens, and police brutality was rampant. And I did a report on it, and I was young and I was very impressionable, and I just said, wow, this is really unfair. This is a violation of civil rights and the rule of law, and it kind of just stuck with me, and I wound up pursuing things of that nature more and more, and then I got a degree in economics, which I did not like. I found it quite boring, quite honestly. And the PhD in sociology was perfect for me to address systemic issues of inequality in the United States.
Excellent. Now, when we spoke offline, you spoke about the affordable housing crisis. And just for the benefit of our viewers, can you share with them what that is?
Yeah, I mean, the crisis, and you alluded to it already in the opening, that, really two problematic things happened all at once. The housing market collapsed in 2008 because of the ways that banks lent money to anyone. No job, no down payment. So what happened, the market collapsed, and what that set in motion was really putting the brakes on new housing construction. So that was one thing. And then COVID happened, which completely disrupted all the supply chains. So housing that got built during COVID, the housing that makes more money, there's a greater profit margin, or it's expensive housing. So the housing that was getting built wasn't on the low end, it was on the higher end. So when the market started to recover, what happened was that materials were hard to get, construction fees went up, and the way to cover that is to basically make houses that are way more expensive. So there's kind of a double whammy of this market collapse because of just the greed of banks and lenders. And then, of course, COVID, which really did disrupt global supply chains. So now we find ourselves in a situation where if you look at the Urban Institute or different places, different things, but anywhere between 5 and 7 million housing for low-income families is needed. So that's the deficit we find ourselves with. And this is not being built. And that's the crisis that you could say fundamentally it's a supply and demand issue. There is a huge demand for affordable housing, and there is just no supply.
Yeah. One of the things I heard you say in our conversation offline that really captured my attention is the color of poverty is black and brown. And you've done research that examines this comparatively. What can you share with our viewers about this?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting trend. What happens is that if you look at poverty in the United States of America, and I always ask my students this, how many people in the United States are poor? I would ask the viewers out there listening to us, like, okay, come up with a number. How many people in the United States are poor? Is it 100,000? Is it a million? And of course, my students are just flabbergasted when I say there's 37 million people in the United States that are at or below the federal government's threshold for poverty. 37, that's a lot. It's 12% of the population, right? But when you start to drill down a little bit of that, what we see is that basically it's racialized. That if you're African American or you're Latino, the poverty rates are much higher. So for white Americans, it's about 8% of the population is poor. For African Americans, about 20%, and Latinos are close to that at 19%. But fundamentally, that for African Americans, Latinos, it's twice the rate. But that's a percentage. But when you look at the raw numbers, in fact, It's 16 million people in the United States. 16 million white people are poor in the United States. 10 million are Latino, and 8 million that are poor are Black. So in fact, in sheer numbers, the poorest racial group in the United States by number are in fact white people, not as a percentage, as a world number, right? But here's what I get at with the perception of poverty. When we talk about poverty, usually the image is someone poor in an urban area that's Black or brown. And what we know is that that's where all of our media stations are, right? You look at where, your local ABC, CBS, Fox, where are they located? They're located in a big city, and it's very easy to get the camera shots you need every day for anything. And you just go outside of your door and, Fox is Third Market or whatever it is. And so what happens is that we don't see the face of poverty is basically lacking a white face. And there are poor white people everywhere, and that's the difference, right? So African Americans, Latinos tend to be clustered in urban areas, and that's the image we get from the media. There are poor white people everywhere. They're in the city, they're in the suburbs, they're in rural counties, right? Go into rural Mississippi, and you're going to see a lot of very poor white people. So that's when I say the color of poverty, and this is, again, kind of selection bias with the media. It's basically how they put the lens on when they do a piece about poverty, they're going to show a Black family. And so it gets cemented, and what it also does is reinforce stereotypes. So that's when I say the color of poverty, that's how it plays out, I think, kind of psychologically in people's heads.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. It's become common practice to exclude and deny housing to individuals that receive, for example, federal subsidies for housing, or people whose income is government-based. So I'm curious if this is an area that you've researched and what your findings have been.
Well, yeah. So, what I do with my students is that they get a fictional budget, and the budget, for them seems like, oh, it's $32,000 and family afford. They think that's a lot, and then they go in and they try to actually find housing. Okay, and the rule of thumb is, it's 30% of your income should never go above that for what you pay in your rent or your mortgage, right? It's a third of your income, right? And we have, as you said, families are way over 50% of their spending, right? And what with vouchers, here's what's interesting about vouchers. In some states, it's illegal for a landlord to not take a voucher. So it goes state by state. There's no federal overview, but so for example, in Texas, landlords don't have to take them. And what do we see? Landlords denying people the vouchers routinely. So it's hard enough to get housing that's affordable with a voucher. Now imagine that you lose a whole pool of real estate agents and landlords that won't take it. And what the voucher system is one of the successes is that you get a voucher in a neighborhood that is what they call resource rich. And especially for young families, that might mean really high performing high schools. So you don't live in a mansion, but you maybe live in an apartment in a community where you have very, very good public schools. And that is literally a game changer for anyone that's young. Because a lot of our schools in the city of Philadelphia, per se, they're under-resourced. They're just under-resourced. And what that means is that students in the city versus a suburb, they're getting unequal educations. So that's it. The vouchers do a lot of things. They also can move you in a neighborhood that's safer, that's cleaner, right? That's you don't have to worry environmental racism or the toxins, what you might. And then also what you get for your children is quality public schooling.
And now I'm going to switch gears a little bit because you kind of touched on this with your last response. Talk to me about the concept of housing and generational wealth. And you can take as long as you want on this one, because this is what people don't understand about this inequality.
Right. So, I mean, the idea is we think about wealth, right? Your assets are, what you own and what you have in the bank, minus your liabilities and all that. But really, what is important is wealth, right? And the idea, it takes generations to accumulate wealth. And for most Americans, the number one way you accumulate wealth is by purchasing a house. And so this happens, there's all sorts of tricks you can do if you're wealthy. It's easy to pass money on. I was just thinking about this in preparation that there's a law, a bill where you can give basically a gift to your child up to $17,000 each parent. So each parent can give $17,000 to their children. So by the time that child's 18, they have $600,000 in the bank. And there's many families that can, afford this. So that's a really nice way to kind of start on third base. And in all likelihood, the parents can probably pay for the tuition for college, which is another form of a hidden transfer of wealth that's intergenerational. And so these things play out like that. But the way that most Americans, the single asset they have is their house. And it really, you need to go back to the housing markets after World War II. Cities were just busting. If you came out of World War II and you have a new bride, you're probably living with a relative in the city because there were and this is everywhere, Chicago, New York, Philly, there just was no housing. So people were busting at the seam. The federal government steps in and was probably one of the greatest giveaways to white America ever. It's the suburbs. It's the GI Bill, which typically excluded black men from loans. And it was an opening up of these gigantic tracts of land that were farm or woodland. They were all clear cut and leveled. And the federal government completely built all the infrastructhe roads that went out there, the electrical lines, the sewer lines. They put in the best public schools imaginable. They put in everything. They put in the firehouses and police stations. That was basically tax dollars. And quite honestly, the beneficiaries of that were basically white families. So that house that you bought in 1950 for $18,000 is now in any suburb in Philadelphia, especially an affluent one, is worth at least $600,000 or $700,000. And that is when grandma dies, where does that money go? It goes to the grandkids. It goes into a trust. Now, if you didn't get your foot in the door of that bonanza, and you didn't get in there, right, in all likelihood, because legally you couldn't. What we were plagued with in the housing markets, really, it goes on today still. But, we all know it's redlining, literally banks drawing a red line. They use a crayon. It really was a red line where you couldn't get a mortgage. So you couldn't get out of your neighborhood. You could buy into a neighborhood. We had redlining, we had steering. That is like a middle-class black family. They're not even shown properties in a white suburb. They're not even shown it, right? So we have restricted covenants, right? So Levitt, one of the largest builders of homes in the United States of America, Levittown, there's Levitts everywhere. In their policies, it was stated the house could not be sold to someone that was black or brown, and often they included Jews in that. And so it was a restricted covenant. And they were on the books really till the 70s and 80s, right? Mm-hmm. So you had And then you had block busting, what people did also, which is another trick where realtors kind of constantly are flipping houses, right? Changes the demographics of the neighborhood. And then really, a lot of how this money, why houses appreciated so much is zoning. In these suburbs, they're very pretty, and it's a white picket fence, and you're sitting on a half of an acre. You can't have density. You can't build. And so what that means is that the only people that can live there are people that can afford to buy into the neighborhood. And if you didn't buy in 30 years ago, everybody knows watching the housing market, it's insanity now. To move into a neighborhood that has the trifecta, and the trifecta would be very, very highly regarded public schools, that's on a regional rail line or a good public transportation grid. It has what people want today is a walkability index. You can walk to get a cup of coffee or walk to get a sandwich. You're talking now that you're pricing out almost 80% of Americans from the housing market. And if your family didn't have the ability to get on that gravy train when the suburbs opened up, you kind of missed that ship because it's become so expensive. And layer on top of that, how does one accumulate wealth? It's by having a good job. And what did that good job mean in 1950? I grew up in a working class neighborhood in Philadelphia, and I know that my father was in a teachers union, a high school teachers union. He didn't get paid a lot, but he got retirement, he got health benefits. If you're white in Philadelphia and you're middle class now, my guess is 40, 50, 70 years ago, someone was in a union, or someone was able to get a job that was completely monopolized by whites. And by that, I mean City Hall, the police department, firefighters, teachers. These jobs, they were written for and really occupied by white folks. And so you have two things going on at the same time. The ability to basically create wealth through your job, your occupation, and then also to create wealth through this house you got. My dad got his house in the GI Bill. It was, it was cheaper to buy. It was a row house, but it was cheaper to buy a row house than it was to rent. And of course, that property that my mother's still in is now appreciated. And so those transfers go to the children of the grandchildren. And that's how wealth accumulation happens. And it's almost invisible because what your house can be is a piggy bank. If you want to, you can take equity out of your house. And what do you want equity for? Well, I want to take out money because I want to help my children buy their own house. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take out a line of credit on my house because this house is a cash cow. It's appreciated so much in the last 40 years. I want them to basically get into a neighborhood they couldn't afford on their income. So there's all these different ways that this wealth that's there can be used down the road. And certainly when grandmom and mom and pop die, where is that house going to? It's going to the kin.
Yeah. So, you've given me a lot to think about there, and I always hearken to the argument that is made by many. Well, why don't they just pull themselves up by their own bootstraps? And that argument falls to the wayside when we hear someone such as yourself that has put so much time and study into this subject.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about folks that, never mind the bootstraps, they didn't have the boots to begin with. So,
That's right.
it means a lot. Now, in terms of, there's a term, affordable housing, and it's developed a negative stereotype. Can you explain this to our viewers, and is it time to change that narrative given that so many people are affected by the housing affordability crisis?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought that up because I think that affordable housing is become synonymous with a voucher. And voucher is basically poor folks that don't have the manners of the middle class, and when they come into our community, it's going to basically hurt property values. This is not what happens, right? And then part of the reason we have people that are having affordable housing issues is one, price of housing, and two, we have so many poor people in the United States of America for a very simple reason. We pay them poverty wages. If you are, so you think in Philadelphia, what they say in Philadelphia. And again, I asked my students this question as well. I said, I want you to imagine you're a family of four. What number would you consider is the threshold for being poor? And they say, 60,000, 70,000. Family of four in a big city, the sixth largest city in the country. I say it's $26,000 a year. How do you possibly survive in a more, now, Philadelphia is not expensive as New York City, but Philadelphia is no longer cheap. So the question becomes, you know, who has, first off, we have lots of poor people. Philadelphia is the sixth largest city in the country, but it's number one in what they call deep poverty. And that's having more than 50% of the population under the federal guideline. So what we don't just have poverty, we have intense poverty as percentage. We have way more poor than New York or Baltimore or Chicago, right? So you have this going on. And then what happens when you hear affordable housing, it automatically becomes linked to the word voucher. And voucher basically are the undeserving poor. That's how it's gotten linked. And quite honestly, that's how I think in many ways it's gotten used politically. It's to demonize it. You know, and the idea was that, you know, the federal government did it once before, right? It was called the GI Bill, right? We did that. And all we need to do is look across the Atlantic. And if you look at other countries, you know what housing is? It's a right. It is a fundamental, the way that we think about civil rights, you have a right to housing. And the government says, yeah, people are better citizens, they're better members of the community if they have guaranteed housing. And what you do is you index it based on how much money they make. It's not rocket science. You just say, the problem with vouchers now is that there is such a demand for them and it's just wildly underfunded. So, you know, again, the thing is that we don't, in the United States of America, we just don't like poor people, kind of for what the reason you said. It was like, hey man, just pick yourself up for your bootstraps. Like, well, you know, it's if you wake up on third base, because, you know, I always tell my students this, I say, pick your parents well and marry up. And they laugh, but by the end of the semester, they get it. That if you're born to upper middle class parents, your world is very, very different. And it's simply different because you have different options. You have different choices about where your life's going to go. If you're fretting constantly about trying to make ends meet and pay the rent, and do I pay my rent or do I pay my gas? This is a really stressful world you're living in.
That is a powerful statement, and it harkens back to what you mentioned earlier. It has to do with some of the media perceptions that are being flooded out there, because you said, you know, the majority of poor by percentage are in the white community. However, what is shown to the community is a drastically different picture. And you also have developed a list of ways to address the housing affordability crisis. Take us through that list.
Yeah, and these are, you know, some of them I'm cribbing from other people, and this is kind of part of the literature. You know, and kind of talking about vouchers, you know, simply more vouchers. It's underfunded. You know, we are the richest nation on the earth. China isn't even near us in our gross domestic product. No country comes near us in terms of our wealth, our assets, our military. This is a political choice. You make a choice to have a lot of poor people or not. This is literally a choice. And what we need is a political leadership to do it. I think our country could probably go with a few less, you know, aircraft carriers or a few less B-1 bombers. I mean, our military, no one can hold a match to our military. I mean, do we, I'm picking on the military a little bit, but they got more money than they asked for last year. Right. I mean, so this is, again, these are choices you make. It's either guns or butter. And the butter here basically is building. Right. So certainly more vouchers. Right. Building affordable units. That is creating some private public ventures where you incentivize developers to say, if 30% of these condos you're putting up are affordable, then you'll get a tax break. Right. That is, you can certainly motivate people through a carrot. Certainly has worked. You know, we talked about this already, kind of what they call upzoning. And that is, zoning was done by design to keep undesirables out. And who are renters? And renters is a bad word for some people too. Oh, you're a renter, right? I mean, you know, it wasn't that way. People, you know, 100 years ago rented. They didn't really own properties like they do now. So there's certainly what you could do, but that means coming into a community. And I live right outside of the city. I'm in Montgomery County, and it would be a firestorm if someone came into this community and said, we want to put up affordable housing. I guarantee you it would be a NIMBY, not in my backyard. I'm all for it, and people deserve housing, but not here. And that is a real obstacle, right? So it's going to be very, very hard to change zoning laws. The only thing that people are talking about now, with the advent of Amazon and everybody, just the death of the mall, right? There's all these strip malls and malls There's also all this office space, right? All of a sudden we realize I don't really need to be in my office. We don't need to have 2,000 people on 4 floors. And so what's happened now, commercial property has become available. People are thinking about repurposing, and there's kind of a move afoot. Why don't we figure out a way? It's not so easy to repurpose into housing, but you could do it.
Yeah.
So, and also there's something called accessorizing dwelling units. And that is and this is, again, my grandparents' generation. You had someone on the 3rd floor that you rented to. You basically bring in, basically people that can stay with you, or you figure out a way to carve an apartment out of your house. And, again, and I want to say this, there isn't any one panacea. There's no magic bullet. It's going to have to be all these things at once, so, and also something that kind of completely fell off the table that was really getting some traction was manufactured housing. It's like Lego housing, right? It's assembled at a factory. It's built basically on there, and it's assembled on site. And these are not the kind of trailer homes like from the 40s that blow away with wind. These are good housing.
Yeah.
It's cheap. It's efficient. Philadelphia has a Philadelphia Trust Fund where they're working with the city and the state. They purchase land, and that land is used for housing. And it is public. It's shared public. So, there's things we could do. The low-income housing tax credits were very popular, where the banks would get, if you want to, banks had to give a small amount of their profits into communities where they were serving them. And, again, half of 1% doesn't sound like a lot, but if your bank is making $50 billion a year, that 1% or half 1% can go a long way to build affordable housing.
It makes a difference.
So, all these things have been tried to different levels, and they're all operating now. But there is, HUD does very good work. But what has happened, but some people believe that government is the problem. I don't believe that. I think that good government can basically solve problems, and that government isn't bad. The idea is that, people that go on about, they want to take the government in a bathtub and drown it. I'm like, well, don't you want clean water? And don't you want roads that don't have potholes? And don't you want great public schools like a Penn State? This is what the government does.
Yep.
So we can do these things if we have the will to do it. But we haven't had administrations that have put a lot of their energies into solving. And part of it is because there's just so much money to be made. My daughter lives in Bushwick in New York City, in Brooklyn, and they raised her rent in 1 year 30%. And there was no law saying it couldn't be done.
That's right.
And this is the problem, that there was a man running in New York City. He was running on the campaign. The rent's too damn high. And there's some truth in that. It is. And again, we don't want to step into the private sector, But when a bank fails, it's so funny how fast, right? The federal government is there to write a check, right? So the idea that, it's like, what is the risk you're really taking if I'm bailing you out?
Right.
And here we're talking about a product that benefits everyone. We know that stable housing, it really creates for better communities. Why? Because then you're in the town much. Then you go to the PTA. Then you're part of the community. If you're constantly moving because you're evicted or you're getting pushed out because of gentrification, no one benefits from this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Listen, thank you so much for joining us here on PHRC Speaks, Professor. And we look forward to hearing more about your works on this subject, and we'll connect. And it's been a powerful time with you. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for having me. You have a great day.
You too. I also want to thank you, the viewer, for joining us today. For more information on this topic, or if you believe that you've been a victim of discrimination in a housing transaction, you can visit us online at www.phrc.pa.gov or call us at 717-787-9780. We're also pretty easy to find online on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. That's it for this edition of PHRC Speaks. Until next time, take care, be good, and be fair to each other.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN. To get your program on PCN Fusion and for more information, contact info@pcntv.com.